Chapter 1 of The Tragic Bride. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Tragic Bride by Frances Brett Young. Chapter 1. And first of all, I dreamed of Roscarna. Partly for the sheer pleasure of reconstructing a shadowy countryside that I remembered. Partly because Roscarna, the house in which the Hewish family had run to seed in its latter generations, was very much to the point. 20 miles from Galway, and Irish miles at that, it stands at the foot of the mountains on the edge of the tract that is called Joyce's country, a district famous for inbreeding and idiocy, where everyone was called Joyce, excepting, of course, the Hewishes of Roscarna, who were aliens. Elizabethan adventurers from the county of Devon, cousins of the Earls of Halberton, who had planted themselves upon the richest of the Joyces' lands in the early 17th century, and built their house in the English fashion of the time. I imagine that it was the founder of the house who paved his river bed with marble slabs, smoothing the stickles into a long clear slide. Labor, no doubt, was cheap or forced, and the Elizabethan fancy lavish. In the mouth of the valley, where it opens on the lake, they planted a girdle of dark woods growing so near to the new house that the Hewishes, walking in their gardens, could almost fancy themselves in England, and lose sight of the mountain slopes that swept up into the crags behind them. The house stood with its back to the hills and all western barrenness, looking over a level, terraced sward, past a river that had been tamed to the smoothness of a chalk stream, to homely woodlands of beech and elm that might well have been haunted by nightingales, if only there had been nightingales in Ireland. There were no nightingales in Devon, so that the first Hewish was under no necessity of importing them to complete his picture. But he had his gravelled walks, his poet's avenue of yews that grew kindly, his sundials with their graceful and melancholy admonitions, his box hedges and white peacocks, and the fancy of some Hewish unknown had blossomed at last in a Palladian bridge of freestone spanning the quiet river. Roscarna, in fact, was a bold experiment, destined from the first to fail. Never, in all its history, could it have become the living thing that its founders dreamed, any more than the Protestant church that they built in the village of Clonderriff could be the home of a living faith. For though they turned their backs upon the mountains of Joyce's country, the mountains were always there, and the house itself, which should have glowed with the warmth of red brick, or one of those soft building stones that mellow as they weather, seemed always cold and desolate, being made of a hard, cold Connaught rock that made the Palladian bridge look like the fanciful toy that it was, and grew bleaker, bluer, colder as the years went by. I think of it as one thinks of the villas that Roman colonists built above the marches of Wales, built obstinately on the Roman plan that the climate of Italy had dictated to their fathers, with open atrium and terraces protected from the sun. "What's good enough for Rome," they said, "is surely good enough for Siluria." And shivering, showing the latest official visitor a landscape that might have been transported bodily from the Sabine hills, if only there were more sun. "But we do miss the lizards and the cicalas," they would say with a sigh. No doubt the most enthusiastic built themselves Paladin. I mean Etruscan bridges and marble stew ponds for mullet, until, in the end, the immense inertia of the surrounding country asserted itself and the natural desires of mankind led to a mingling of British blood with theirs, till the Roman of the first century became the Briton of the third. The parallel is as near as it may be, for though the first Hewish was an Englishman, his great-great-grandson was Irish, and the only thing that was left to remind him of his ancestry was the house of Roscarna, the sullen Connaught stone fixed in an alien design, and the huge belt of timber through which the gorse and heather were slowly creeping down from the mountain and settling in the valley bottom that they had once inhabited. But the foreign woods that trailed along the shore of the lake were admirable for blackcock. The transformation was very gradual. The first Hewishes, no doubt, kept in touch with their English cousins. London was their metropolis, and to London, in the fashions of their remote province, they would return with amusing tales of Irish savagery that made them good company in an 18th-century coffee-house. Little by little they found their English interests waning, and the social centre shifting westwards. Dublin became their city, and to a stately house in Merrion Square the family coach migrated in the season, until, at last, it seemed hardly worth while to cross the dreariness of the central plain, and a town house in Galway seemed the zenith of urbanity. Galway, indeed, had risen on a wave of prosperity. In the streets above the Claddagh, merchants who had grown rich in the Spanish trade were building solid houses with carved lintels and windows of stained glass. The Hewishes invested money in these new ventures. In Galway a Hewish of Roscarna was somebody. There the family was taken for granted, and following the way of least resistance, the Hewishes settled down into the state of provincial notabilities. Notabilities, as long as the Spanish money lasted, then notorieties. For as Roscarna, the symbol of a tradition, decayed, the men of the Hewish family developed a curious recklessness in living. It was as though the original vigor of the tree planted in a foreign soil had been enough to keep it fighting and flourishing for a couple of 100 years, and then had suddenly failed, dying, as a tree will, from above downwards. For the first half of the 19th century a series of dissolute Hewishes, they never bred in great numbers, lived wildly upon the edge of Connemara, drinking and fighting and gaming and wenching while the roof of Roscarna grew leaky and the long stables were turned into pigsties, and soft mud silted over the marble bottom below the Palladian bridge. If they had lived in England, the estate would have vanished field by field until nothing but the house was left. But the outer land of Roscarna was of no marketable value, and when Sir Jocelyn succeeded to the property in the year 1870, he found himself master of many worthless acres and a ruined house that he was powerless to repair. It was no wonder that he went to the dogs like his father before him, for the passage of every generation had made recovery more difficult. Of course he should really have become a soldier, but soldiering in those days was an expensive calling. As a baronet, even as an Irish baronet, a good deal would have been expected of him, far more than the dwindling means of Roscarna could possibly supply, and since every career seemed closed to him but one of provincial dissipation, he is scarcely to be blamed for having followed it. When Colonel Hoylake knew him, he was a middle-aged man and a reformed character, and the fact that he ever came to be either is enough to show that the original Hewish strain was still strong enough to put up some sort of fight. He cannot have been without his share of original virtue, but by his own account his youth, hopeless and therefore abandoned, must have been pretty lurid. Of course he drank. His father must have taught him to do that as a matter of habit. He was equally at home with the ancient sherries, a few bins of which remained in the Roscarna cellars to remind him of the Spanish trading days, or with the liquid fire that the Joyces distilled in the mountains, under the name of potheen. Of course he gambled. He was sufficiently Irish for that, and his gaming passion soon made Roscarna a sort of savage Monte Carlo, to which the more dissolute younger sons of the surrounding gentry foregathered. Blakes and O'Flahertys and Kilkellys and all the rest of them. In the middle of the stables, at the back of the house, stood a huge deserted pigsty surrounded by a stone wall, and this place became under Jocelyn's regime a cockpit in which desperate birds were pitted against one another, fighting fiercely until they dropped. Even in his later days, according to Hoylake, he was not ashamed of these exploits. The gamblers invented for themselves new refinements of sport or cruelty: spider racing. I do not suppose that anyone living today knows what spider racing is. This was the manner of it. At night, when the big black-bellied spiders that haunted the lofts came out to spread their nets, stable boys were sent with candles to collect them in tins, and next morning, when the gamblers assembled in the pigsty at Roscarna, a piece of sheet iron, fired to a dull red heat, would be placed in the center. On this hot surface the long-legged insects were thrown. Naturally they must run or be shriveled with heat, and the one that ran the furthest was counted the winner. Betting on these unfortunate creatures, Jocelyn and his friends spent many happy forenoons, and Jocelyn was counted as a good judge of a spider as any man in Galway. In his dealings with women he was relatively decent, relapsing at an early age into a relation irregular, but so domestic as to be respectable, with a woman named Bridget Joyce, who kept house for him, and cooked potatoes and distilled potheen as well as any female in the district. I do not know if they had many children. If they did, it is probable that these found their vocation in collecting spiders in the stables, or even drifted back into the hill community from which their mother had come. Through all his dissipations, Sir Jocelyn preserved one characteristic, an unerring instinct for field sports that no amount of drinking could impair. He could hit a flying bird with a stone, was a deadly shot for snipe or mallard, rode like a centaur, and fished with the instinct of a heron. It is probable that his consciousness of this faculty was at the bottom of his startling recovery. Possibly he was frightened to find a little of his skill failing. I only know that at the age of 48 he pulled himself up short. His eyes, seeing clearly for the first time in his life, became aware of the appalling ruin into which Roscarna had fallen. He became sober for 6 days out of the 7, setting aside the Sabbath for the worship of Bacchus, and during the remainder he devoted himself seriously, steadily, to the reclamation of his estate. He repaired the roof of the house with new blue slates, cleared the attics of owls and the chimneys of jackdaws, he dredged the river and discovered the marble bottom, netted the pike and put down yearling trout. Gradually he restored Roscarna to its old position as a first-class sporting property, and so, having fought his way back, step by step, into the company of decent men, he married a wife. Hardly the wife one would have expected from a Hewish, it is true. Her name was Parker, her father was a shopkeeper in Baggot Street, Dublin, and how Hewish met her God only knows. She was a sober, plain-sailing Englishwoman, a Protestant, with a religious bias that may have made the reformation of a dissolute baronet attractive to her. She had a little money, to which she stuck like glue, and an abundance of common sense. It speaks well for the latter that she appreciated from the first the value of Biddy Joyce in the kitchen, and kept her there, boiling potatoes, although she knew that she had been her husband's mistress. Firmly but certainly she ordered Jocelyn's life, realizing with him that Roscarna was worth saving, subsidizing, with a careful hand, his attempts to restore the woods and waters, interesting herself in the housing of his tenants, and renewing the connection of Roscarna with the parish church at Clonderriff, of which the Hewishes were patrons. It was she who appointed Marmaduke Considine to the vacant living. For 10 years she lived soberly with Sir Jocelyn at Roscarna, hoping ardently that a son might be born to them who should carry on the family name and succeed to the fruits of her economies. In the 11th year of their married life it seemed that her hopes were to be realized. Even Jocelyn, the new Jocelyn, appreciated the importance of the event. He and Biddy Joyce, now an old and shriveled woman, but one unrivaled in maternal experience, nursed Lady Hewish as though the whole of their future happiness depended on it. Every Sunday young Mr. Considine dined at Roscarna with the family, and spent the evening in religious discussions with her ladyship. Every month the doctor rode over from Galway to feel her pulse. On a dark winter evening in the year 1883 the child was born, a girl. They christened her Gabrielle, and a week later Lady Hewish died. End of chapter 1. Recording by Roger Moline.